Good afternoon. I'm Alan Solomont, the Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life. Welcome to tonight's Distinguished Speaker Series event focused on politics and the press in the age of Trump. We're pleased to welcome four outstanding figures in political journalism: Juana Summers, political reporter at NPR; John Harris, the founding editor of Politico; Boston's own Alison King, political reporter at NBC10 Boston. And moderating the conversation, we have a slight change in the program. Unfortunately, David Gregory is under the weather tonight and won't be able to join us. We wish him a speedy recovery, but we're delighted to welcome Tisch College Senior Fellow for Media and Civic Engagement, Julie Dobro, to moderate tonight's panel. Before we get started, I want to thank Jumbo Vote, the Political Science Department, the Edward R. Murrow Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for supporting today's event and many other Tisch College events this year. We've had a busy semester featuring extraordinary guest speakers like Pete Buttigieg, Van Jones, Yamiche Alcindor, and many others. And we're not done yet. Next week, we are hosting Latosha Brown, the founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund. On November 12th, we'll hear from Congressman Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Committee on Intelligence. And on November 20th, we'll welcome Tufts alumnus and Simpsons legend, Hank Azaria. Please go to tischcollege.tufts.edu/events to register for these talks and to see our full lineup of speakers. And remember, these events are open to the entire Tufts community, including alumni, parents, community partners, and friends. So feel free to let others know and share the link so that they can register. We are now exactly 2 weeks away from the 2020 election, which will be the culmination of an unprecedented campaign season. And depending on the result, it will either be the end or the midpoint of an unprecedented presidency. For the past 5 years, the media has been the main filter through which we learn about and interpret American politics in the era of Donald Trump. The media has been trying to navigate the challenges of reporting on a candidate, a president, and an administration that acts like no other in American history. We are honored to welcome four leading figures who cover politics and who, in different roles and from different platforms, have been thinking about and dealing with these challenges as they strive to keep us informed about civic and political life. Juana Summers is a political reporter for NPR covering demographics and culture. She has covered politics since 2010 for important media outlets, including Politico, CNN, and the Associated Press. She has also covered Congress for NPR. Juana appears regularly on television and radio to discuss national politics. In 2016, she was a fellow at Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service. She's a native of Kansas City, Missouri, and a graduate of the Missouri School of Journalism. I also understand she's a competitive pinball machine player. Never heard of that, but we'll see if there's a question from the audience. John Harris is the founding editor of Politico, one of the country's most visited news sites, and a go-to source of information and analysis for anyone following the goings-on in our democracy. Before launching Politico, John spent 21 years at the Washington Post covering local politics, Virginia state politics, and national issues. He also covered the Clinton presidency and wrote a book called The Survivor: Bill Clinton in the White House. John also co-authored The Way to Win: Taking the White House in 2008. He's a frequent political commentator on shows like CBS's Face the Nation, PBS's Washington Week, and MSNBC's Morning Joe. Most importantly, he's the proud Tufts parent of Liza Harris, a Tufts senior and a budding journalist herself. Alison King is a political reporter at NBC10 Boston. She first joined the station in 1995, and she's covered 6 presidential races and a wide range of New England political stories, including a documentary on the late Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. Her work has also included covering the 1988 Winter Olympics, reporting from Bosnia after the war, and a one-on-one interview with President Obama. Alison has earned many awards for her work, including 3 Emmys, 2 Gracies, and several Associated Press awards. Moderating today's conversation is our own Julie Dobro. A Tisch College Senior Fellow for Media and Civic Engagement, Julie develops and teaches courses on civic media. She coordinates internships on issues having to do with media and civic engagement, and she runs workshops on media literacy training for parents, teachers, and students. She previously worked as a journalist herself. In 2016, Julie co-taught a popular course with David Gregory through Tisch College called Race to the White House in a Modern Media Environment. This allowed students to do real-time media analysis of that year's presidential election. In addition to her work at Tisch College, Julie is also the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, a lecturer in the Department of Public Health and Community Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, and a senior lecturer at the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Study and Human Development, where her research focuses on the content and effects of media on children. We're excited to welcome Julie and all of our panelists to share their insights tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome, Juana, Alison, and John. It is great to see you all. Alison, always great to welcome you back to Tufts. So I'm going to ask a few questions that are for each of you individually, but I also am going to ask some questions that are really for all 3 of you to bat around. And I want to start with one of those. Has covering politics and political campaigns changed since Donald Trump was elected president? So John, let's start with you if we can.
Sure. And first off, just very briefly, hello to my fellow panelists, including former Politico, Juana Summers. Nice to see you. And Alan, thanks for the generous words. And thanks especially also for what you've done for the whole Tufts community with your leadership of the Tisch Center. It's really been an important part of my daughter's experience at Tufts, and I would say mine as a parent. I love it. So congratulations on your great run there. Yes, is the answer to your question. It has changed. The presidency was always the focal point of our national politics. It was always a focal point of Washington news coverage. It was always an intense beat. I don't think there's any precedent in American history of just quite the consuming nature of the way Trump sort of dominates every second of every news cycle. It's made it much harder to cover the news just in terms of sheer keeping up. But I think at a more profound level, it's made it hard to do what I think is the responsibility of journalists, which is to focus attention on what's important and to be able to give sustained attention to matters that are central to the public, holding their public officials accountable. And I think that's much harder to do now. People are so in such a frenzied frame of mind. As so many people have noted, our politics has become so tribal. Everything is about which side are you on. Every news story is a weapon or a shield rather than being taken at face value. And just as citizens, and I'd say as journalists as well, like, the pace of news is such that we have trouble remembering what we were up in arms about last week. So I think, yes, it's all quite a change, and I think it's going to take us, whatever happens next week or in 2 weeks, I think it's going to take us a good long time to figure out what's changed in the institution of journalism during the Trump presidency and how we respond to it. I think that's going to be the work of several years of reorienting ourselves.
Thanks. Juana, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think one of the other things that's changed a lot is, at least in the 10 years or so that I've been doing this, we haven't really experienced covering an administration that is so often steeped in outright falsehoods. And that has caused a lot of us within our newsrooms to have to be really reflective as to how we challenge those falsehoods and how we are honest with our audience, and to make sure that they understand what the intent of the president's words and policies are. I don't cover the White House. My background is largely in campaigns and on Capitol Hill. And I think for me, one of the things that stayed the same, to offer a little bit different of a perspective, is that for me, I really feel like my job as a campaign reporter is to help my audience understand, if either President Trump or former Vice President Biden is elected, what it'll mean for their daily lives, whether that's how they'll feed their families, what will happen to this country's immigration policy, protections for LGBTQ individuals. And I think that's fundamentally what I've always seen is at the heart of campaign reporting, is helping. We have unprecedented access to these candidates every day. Now, some a little more than others, and that's certainly different in this campaign, given COVID and everything else. But we have a front row seat to being able to talk with and engage these folks that the people who are voting for them don't have. So it's our job to help them understand the people they're voting for as humans, as policymakers. And I think that even despite, I agree with everything John said, despite all of those challenges, that part of my job remains the same today.
Allison, what are your thoughts?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to you, Julie and Alan. And I wish this were in person so I could meet Juana and John in person as well and shake your hands, because you're such great journalists. I don't specifically cover the White House or Washington, D.C. or national politics. So I look at it through the lens of what I'm covering here in Boston as the political reporter in Massachusetts. And I worry a lot about what's not getting covered because of the fact that we're so intensely focused on sort of what I call the story du jour out of the White House. And, you know, we have to, I could do a story, as we all could every day. I could do a local angle on the immigration story out of the White House, or the local angle out of whatever crisis, the wow, can you believe what he said today story. And I really, you know, we started to go down that road early on in the administration. And I think you just have to put the brakes on and say, you know, you can't just be all consumed by this. So it's definitely changed a lot of, you know, sort of the focus of what I've done as a local TV news reporter. And, you know, I agree with both what John and Juana said. Just, you know, it's the fire hose syndrome, and you just have to be very selective about what hole you go down.
Yeah, well, you know, let me follow up on a thread that each one of you touched on there. Some pundits have suggested that responsible news organizations just shouldn't cover some of the factually incorrect and arguably dangerous things that candidates, not just Donald Trump, but a lot of what Donald Trump says. And that instead, news organizations should really focus on other things that, as Juana suggested, are really important in the lives of everyday people. So I guess I'm wondering what each of you think about this. Where is the balance? What kind of attitude should news organizations take when we do have so many things that are uttered by candidates that are factually incorrect? So Juana, why don't we start with you on that?
Sure. So I certainly understand the sentiment, but I think it's, for those of us at least covering national politics, I think it's incumbent on us to do both things at the same time. It is important for us, especially, you know, I work in a newsroom, and a news organization that has a lot of great local and regional partners across the country that can speak to the issues that are relevant to local community and help them understand how policies made in Washington and parroted on the campaign trail impact their lives. But the fact of the matter is, and I think this is largely a concern about President Trump. President Trump is the president of the United States, and I would find it hard to see any reality in which we don't report on what the president says and ask questions about what the president says and what the president means, and make clear to our audiences when the president says things that are either wildly exaggerated or are untrue. I think one of the things that we've done really well at NPR is we took a good hard look this year at how we do our debate coverage. And one of the things I love is that we're not just doing stenography of saying insert candidate here said X. We're doing real-time fact checking with a team of a dozen plus reporters and correspondents who are subject matter experts, so that when a claim is made, say about, I don't know, the Green New Deal, for example, and President Trump misstates former Vice President Biden's record, we're able to put some context behind that, explain what the policy is that he is talking about and where Joe Biden actually stands on the issues, rather than just putting out an attack, rather than just quoting an attack with no meat on the bones. So I think it's really important to find the balance. I do think one of the things that I hope that we've learned, and I think a lot of news organizations have done some correction around, is that we can't just simply repeat word for word what is said from the White House or from the campaign trail. We can't do that for the Democratic candidate either. It's incumbent on us to make sure that we're grounding what we report in truth and facts and making it clear for our audience.
John, how are you handling this at Politico?
Well, I think Juana said a lot of sensible things there. I don't like the notion of not covering what a major figure in public life says, because we as editors make a judgment that it's just not worthy, and we're going to suppress that, because it invites a sense that we are almost players in the arena. And I think it challenges readers' confidence or viewers' confidence, and it gets into really an endless and, for me, quite demoralizing game of, well, you didn't do that with this candidate, but you suppressed what that person said, but like you covered this. The great challenge, but to me also the great opportunity, is to help our audience stay oriented. Like, what's real? If you spend your full day in front of a computer screen or in front of a TV screen watching cable, it's really, really easy to be almost like a person in an avalanche, where you're trying to dig out, but you don't really know if you're digging up or down. I think we as journalists can do that. We can explain the context. We can say what's true. We can give a conscientious citizen the tools to make her mind up or his mind up. I think it's valuable. I think it's probably giving ourselves an exaggerated sense of importance if we think that just because, like, we call out, well, Trump, that's a lie. Trump said that's a falsehood. In the old days, I do think that news media had the ability to really frame public discussion, and to throw a flag like that would really have big consequences. Bluntly, that doesn't describe our media culture now. The readers of the New York Times, that if they say, well, Trump was lying about this, it typically needed no convincing in the first place. And people who are partisans on the other side aren't going to aren't going to be chastened by that in any way. We live in an age where the media is not the filter that it was in the past. Anybody can get information for however he or she wants. And we're not quite the kind of court on high. I bluntly didn't mind the old days when we did have more of that role, but like, we just don't. Like, we don't have the same power to set the agenda or to kind of throw somebody out of the game. That's the previous generations of editors did have that, incidentally. But we can do something very, very worthy, which is, as I say, and as Juana said, we can provide the context that's necessary for somebody to feel like, look, I grasp reality. There's a lot of fiction and a lot of illusion in politics, but a conscientious viewer or a reader should have the tools to be able to say, I've got insight into reality. Journalists are helping me with that.
So Alison, I'm very curious what you think about this too, because unlike NPR or Politico, which have more time and more space to cover these sorts of stories, commercial news stations just don't. And so I think, oftentimes it seems to me, just as a viewer and as a consumer myself, that a lot of television news, definitely falls into covering the latest outrage because it's, you know, it grabs eyes. But I wonder, you know, what your thoughts are here. And as a local television news reporter who's covered politics for a long time, you know, where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I mean, one story that just comes to mind from this week is the Hunter Biden story. And, you know, I was up in New Hampshire a few days ago covering a Trump event, and there was a lot of Trump supporters were saying, have you done the Hunter Biden story? And why haven't we seen that? And why are you, no one's touching? And sure enough, I mean, it's not a story that really most media outlets, of course, Fox has done a lot with that. It seems to me, and it's not the kind of story I would delve into anyway, just because it's not, you know, as you point out, it's a complicated story and you need a lot of background to, but it's a story that's sort of been litigated already and it's been out there. There seems to be new twists put on it. Some of the twists don't seem to all jive. So, you know, that's sort of something that I, you know, would struggle with. Is that something that we should, you know, give some airtime to? They, you know, the people I was speaking with up in New Hampshire believe that story hook, line, and sinker, and that think it should be a headline. So I'm not sure, you know, it's something I do struggle with. It's not a story I would necessarily delve into anyway, but I have noticed that, you know, most media outlets have not touched, national media outlets haven't really touched that story.
Yeah. So just moments ago, Nicole Wallace said that Joe Biden has managed to turn a structural disadvantage, by which she meant getting somewhat less attention from the press, into an advantage for his campaign. Do you agree? Alison, let's start with you.
Well, yeah, sure. To the degree that this has been probably in the history of presidential elections, the easiest possible race for, you know, the Democrat to run against the Republican in this case. I mean, Joe Biden has largely seemed to have a strategy of sitting back and, you know, kind of putting stuff out there every day, but for the most part, letting Trump kind of run the show. And as you know, the commonly word used, implode, let Trump implode has been sort of the strategy. And, you know, the fact is we haven't seen a lot of Joe Biden, certainly compared to Donald Trump. And he hasn't been in New Hampshire since the primary. So I think that, you know, his strategy of laying low, and I have been thinking lately, you know, should he be getting out there? He's taking these 3 days off this week. Where is he? Why isn't he doing some virtual events? And, you know, I've had a discussion with some people about it, and they said, you know, no, why should he do anything differently than what he's doing right now? Because it's working for him. So, you know, I think we'll see what happens on Thursday night at this debate. But I think that his strategy right now of laying low and letting Trump run the show, why mess with a good thing? In his opinion.
Juana, what are your thoughts?
Look, I mean, I think even were the Republican candidate not Donald Trump and the Democratic candidate not Joe Biden, we're sitting in the middle of this moment where we have a massive global crisis in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, dire economic ramifications for so many people in this country, as well as a still simmering crisis around race and policing and justice. And the president is at the nexus of all of that. So I think that even if the candidate were not Trump himself, there was going to be outsized attention in this moment in time on the person who is currently in the White House. I don't see any way around it. I do think one thing that I've heard from Democrats that I've talked to is that while, yes, there's some of, you know, Biden letting Trump kind of do his thing and sitting back, they also want to make sure that they're not being complacent. I think that there is a lot of very strong memories of 2016 where some Democrats out there were on a glide path to winning the White House, and obviously that's not what happened. So the Biden and Harris ticket are doing a lot of these virtual events, whether the candidates themselves are involved in them or not, are trying to keep people mobilized, are putting out as many efforts as they can in the middle of this difficult situation where what campaigning fundamentally looks like has kind of been upended for Democrats, at least because of these safety precautions. And I think they're also showing kind of a contrast in priorities when you look at how the two campaigns are campaigning, President Trump and Vice President Pence are still having these large scale events, despite the fact that most public health experts suggest that that's not particularly safe right now without mask requirements and things of that nature. Whereas Biden and Harris, we just saw Senator Harris recently scrap events because several campaign staffers had COVID-19 out of just an abundance of caution. So I do think it's been really interesting to watch how the two campaigns have kind of threaded the needle there and approached this moment that looks so different than I think anything we've ever covered before.
John?
It is a reality that if Joe Biden were elected, if he is elected in 2 weeks, or it may take a couple of months for all we know to actually determine who the winner of this race is, he will be on his first day in office the oldest president ever. He'll be older on the first day than Ronald Reagan was on his last day. And it just seems to me almost inarguable that if under other circumstances, if we weren't in a pandemic, if he were not running against such a flamboyant figure like Donald Trump, there would be persistent, sustained questions about. I don't think there's any evidence that he's incapacitated or senile in the way we think of that. I know that accusation gets thrown around. I do think that he's not fully as commanding a figure as many as he was at a younger age, as many people at that age are. And I think he's done the bare minimum that you can and to run a modern presidential campaign to and satisfy voters that you're up for this most important job.
Thanks. So let me ask a couple of questions that any of the three of you who wish can answer. Again, just sort of as an avid consumer of news myself, one of the things that I've noticed that seems to be very different in this presidential election than in any previous one that I can recall is the coverage of ads, which is of course great for candidates whose ads get covered by news organizations. And I wonder if you agree with me that there seems to be more coverage of ads this year, and if so, what accounts for that? Anybody?
I haven't really perceived that. I'm quite open that you're right about that. The phenomenon of covering ads really aggressively to make sure that we're evaluating the claims. One of my mentors, David Broder, the late David Broder at the Washington Post, he was a real believer in that. He felt that prior to, say, the 1980s, reporters would cover the speeches, but most people are experiencing the campaign through screens. They're not going to candidate speeches, and it was really incumbent upon us to cover the ads very rigorously. Probably we've gone a little too far in that direction, not just in this cycle, but in previous cycles. A really outrageous ad will get attention, but actually it's not really seen by that many people. The sole purpose of the ad is to generate news coverage, and I think we could be a little more disciplined on that type of coverage. If they can buy it.
I think, some of the ads that, I look at what some operations like the Lincoln Project have put on and the kind of, media attention they get. And I mean, I agree with you, Julie, those kind of, they become viral and they do get a lot of attention, but it's, I feel like coming from, in Massachusetts, we don't see the mountains of, TV ads that they're seeing probably in a Pennsylvania, or some of these other swing states. And
Although we do see the New Hampshire ads.
We do, yes, we definitely do. I don't know whether we're blanketed with as much of them, but certainly we do. But, I think because people are we're locked in our homes this year, I think maybe that's one of the reasons people are maybe looking more toward ads than they, have been in the past to get just some information. But And certainly Joe Biden has the money to put plenty of them on the air.
Juana, do you have any thoughts on this you want to contribute?
I mean, I'll be really brief. For me, I have to admit, I don't pay much attention to ads other than especially in some of the congressional races that I follow, that they are important metrics of where and how a candidate's choosing to spend their money. And oftentimes the message can tell you what they're trying to get to stick to their opponent or what kind of message they're trying to send. But I can't tell you the last time I don't cover ads all that often or pay a ton of attention.
So, but you just, let me pick up on one thing that you said there, which is that, one of the dictums that many journalists follow is follow the money. And of course, in this election cycle, there's just been an unbelievable amount of money that has been spent and continues to be spent by different campaigns, and not just presidential campaigns. So actually, let's spend a couple of minutes, if we can, talking about some of the Senate races, which have gotten a lot of publicity. One of the interesting things to me is the amount of money that some candidates have raised, and the just sort of the huge amount of money that seems to be flowing through things like Act Blue and many other organizations. John, I know Politico has spent a lot of time covering some of the money and also some of the Senate races. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that coverage has looked this cycle?
Well, you're quite right. It is. It's a political earthquake, the amount of money that is being raised. It's burying previous records for the amount of money just gushing into some of these critical states. It just reflects the degree that Donald Trump has not just energized his own base, he's really energized Democrats, and people are looking for tangible ways to make their views known. If they're progressives, it's looking for tangible ways to feel like they're helping Democrats, so they're writing checks, tens and tens of millions of dollars in some of these Senate races, including ones that we didn't really think were going to be that competitive, like South Carolina, where Lindsey Graham was presumed to be safe, but now is in a real fight because of the money that his challenger has raised. I do question the efficacy. At some point, there's a diminishing returns on this money. No question, there's some consultants who are getting doing very, very well in this race, and it is making some races that wouldn't be competitive. It's making them competitive. And I don't think we're going to know until we see the results as to whether people were just throwing money out the car window or whether it really had impact.
Juan, is this something that you're covering?
So that is not something that I cover. Actually, that's something that's been endlessly fascinating to me. I've been watching South Carolina race as well as the Kansas Senate race actually has had just a ton of money in a state. I grew up in neighboring Missouri and just could never expect that we'd be talking about a competitive Democrat in the Kansas Senate race this year. One of the things that I found interesting, because I do a lot of voter focused reporting, is I've actually talked to some Democrats about the slew of money that they're pumping into these races, even in states they don't live in. And it gets to what John said. People want to feel like this year in particular that they're doing something, that they have some sort of agency in this political moment. That was something that I heard certainly after the slew of Act Blue donations after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the people wanting to feel like they had power and could do something to oppose what they saw as a Supreme Court nominee coming who would likely be more conservative and tilt the court toward the right. So I think it's been really interesting to see how different people, whether they're protesting or donating money or what have you, are seeking to use that agency and funnel their fear, their hopes, their frustrations at the world and the state of our politics right now.
Yeah, here in Massachusetts, it's just a prime example of that because there are no, contentious races here, particularly. So all the activists, of which there are legions, and there are, expert fundraisers, and whether it's Swing Left or Act Blue, I believe is based in Somerville and, has raised multi-billions of dollars. So it's really mind-boggling to think of the money that's going into some of these races, and you wonder if there's enough airtime to to buy up all of the millions that they poured into it. But you know, and as both Juana and John have pointed out, we're gonna have to wait and see what happens after the election to see how it was, how useful it all was.
So we're going to go to audience questions in a couple of minutes, but before we do, let me just do sort of a quick lightning round of questions and ask you each to respond, but very quickly. Will there be any more October surprises? Alison?
I'm looking at both of the health of Biden and Trump. You know, could Trump have a resurgence of COVID? Is Biden going to stay healthy for the next 2 weeks? I think that could be a big October surprise. And of course, anything can happen, as we know from 4 years ago.
Juana?
You know, I don't like to do predictions, but the one thing that we do know is that across the country, so many people are already voting. The notion in our brains was always election day. We're in election season right now. So even if something else were to change, we've had a ton of people cast their ballots already. So I'll be curious to see if some other seismic event in this race, which Lord knows we've had so many of them, what impact it would have on the votes that are still left out there.
John?
Yes, I think we're going to have more surprises. Why stop now? It's been a year of a cascade of surprises, and really 5 years of surprises, all the way back to Trump's candidacy when he announced in 2015. So yes.
What are your biggest concerns as we head into the next 2 weeks towards November 3rd? Juana?
You know, I think for me, my colleague Scott Detrow and I just finished reporting an hour-long special on voting in America. And the biggest concern we heard from voters is how they will be able to sanely consume the results of the election when, as Alison and John, I think, have both hinted at, there's a chance that, especially on the presidential level, we might not have an answer for people on November 3rd. We might not have one on November 4th. So I think the biggest thing that keeps me up at night is thinking through our live coverage and figuring out a way to communicate with our listeners and our audiences online that helps them figure out how to navigate the returns as they understand them and helps them understand the process and to have faith in the process.
John?
I'm sorry, am I next? I would say one concern is that we, in the news business, that we keep our wits about us. So we know that there's efforts to manipulate events and news. I feel to some extent we were manipulated in 2016, and so how do we report the news but not get basically not get played?
Alison?
Yeah, I guess just, you know, that there's not a lot of violence after the election. I mean, that's what kind of scares me a little bit. And I think that the best thing that could happen in that regard is maybe to have one candidate blow the other out on election night, but you know, that's probably not going to happen. And I worry about the weeks afterwards and the kinds of, you know, protests, rallies, and whatnot that could occur.
Okay, one more lightning round question, and we'll go to questions from our audience. And this is a question for me, for my students who are asking me, for my friends, for my family, from all of you folks who are in the news. What is your best advice to those of us who consume the news? What can we do not to stress out as we watch the news over the next couple of weeks or longer? So John, let's start with you.
Well, I could give a very long answer to that. How to?
But we're in the lightning round.
The short answer is maybe alcohol will help.
But our students under 21, you didn't hear that. Alison?
I don't know, bubble baths. I think that you really have to, and I'm guilty of this, and my husband and my kids say, turn that channel and get it off. That you know, don't watch it 24/7 if you possibly can help it, because there's just no point. You can get your headlines. I also encourage people, if you're a Fox watcher, watch some MSNBC, or whatever, if you're on vice versa. If you're an MSNBC person, watch Fox, and digest a little bit of both outlets or several outlets. And of course, you're a nice mix of print and radio and TV, and then turn it all off.
And Juana?
I think I'll tailor my advice towards specifically election returns. I think the best thing you can do if you're watching the results come in and waiting to see what's happening on election night is to stay off social media, because that often just shows you a snapshot in time and isn't going to be your best source to get reliable information. Things get amplified very quickly, some of which are true, some of which are not true. So I would say pick a couple as Allison said, pick a couple trusted sources of media, a variety, perhaps even across the ideological spectrum, and check in with them, but don't feel like you need to doom scroll your way through election night.
Okay, great. That's wonderful advice. Okay, so we have a question from Minako.
Hello, I'm Minako Tateno. I'm a student of Regis School of Law and Diplomacy's LLM program. At first, I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists for coming today. My question is about the role of press in society. Since the development of broadcasting service, I think it's been often said that the press must contribute to the public welfare, as you can see in many laws such as 1927's Radio Act. So my questions are, what is the definition of public welfare for you? And do you think that the press coverages today serve the public welfare?
So any of the three of you can answer.
Oh, I'll give it a shot. The tradition of journalism I grew up in is not an advocacy tradition. We see it as our job to report and to illuminate issues and establish some fundamental facts about what's happening in our public life, and then let other people argue about it. I don't. I'm an advocate for things like truth telling. I think it's wrong for politicians or presidents to lie. But I'm not an advocate for particular sides of the ideological debates in my personal views of these things, but my professional views are insulated from that. By the way, that's a different tradition than a lot of journalists, including some very good journalists who I respect. That's a different tradition than a lot of journalists are doing these days, where they do see themselves as advocates, and they are putting the news through their prism of one kind or another, and that's okay. I just think the reader should know, or the viewer should know, the difference between a news organization that's fundamentally news-driven versus one that's fundamentally advocacy-driven. The thing I would say, and I'll just tie it back to your speed round question before, I do think this is important. People who are over 21 can have a drink if they want, if they're really stressing out. But the real antidote to stressing out is to realize, like, let's play the long game here. The election does not belong to the candidates. It doesn't belong to the journalists. It belongs to the voters. And the problems that we have as a country, that's I think what the questioner is getting at with the public welfare. They're not going to be resolved in the course of one election. So if you win, your side wins, great. If you lose, despair for a night or a week, but no longer than that. Well, you just suit up and get ready for the next contest, is my view.
Juana or Alison, you want to add anything?
I think John said that beautifully.
Great, thank you, Minako. Our next question comes from Lindsay.
Hi there, thank you. Hi everyone, and hi Allison, it's good to see you again. I'm Lindsay Hammis. I work actually at Fletcher's Office of Communications and PR, so I've been in touch with Allison before, but neither you, Juana, nor you, John. So it's nice to meet you guys. Just a quick question. I found this incredibly interesting, and you guys are all from obviously super important news organizations, whether at the national, local, or regional levels. And people obviously turn to you for being that important source, trusted source of the news. So I was wondering, because we're hearing so much about this potential coming red wave on the evening of the election, what are your actual organizations doing anything or having anything put into place so that there's there's a way to report on election night without giving a false sense of who has won or who, has lost, perhaps prematurely, especially given we may not have actual results until days, weeks, maybe months after the night.
Very important
Well,
question.
NBC, has a policy. They have a whole sort of war room that makes the decision about whether it should be announced, whether someone wins or not. And there is a very high bar to meet. You don't just grab somebody else said something and you throw it out there. So they will be very careful with that. And NBC has done a good job of making it very clear, do not expect a decision on that evening. And I think that we cannot, as journalists, repeat that enough. Maybe there will be, but I think there's a greater chance that we won't know and that it could be for a couple of days. And I think the more the public gets that message and understands that, hopefully there won't be as much surprise and frustration. But I think that, it's incumbent on all news outlets to be extremely careful about, exit polling and just whatever they put out there as a final winner.
Juana, what's
Yeah.
going to happen over at NPR?
Yeah, so we work with the AP and take AP calls for election nights. And having worked at the AP, I mean, they're the gold standard. They very rarely get it wrong, and they have a very meticulous process for ensuring that their calls are accurate. That we'll go with. But the message in our newsroom has been, we are planning our staffing in that it's not just election night; it's election season. Because our voting team and our election security team has done a lot of work on this because of the sheer number of early votes and mail-in votes that are being cast this year due to safety concerns. We in some states are not able to start counting until fairly late. We recognize, particularly on the presidential level, for some of the states we're most interested in, we might not get a result very soon. So we've tried, even in just our coverage now that we're 2 weeks out, we're talking about this as a season. We're trying to prepare our audience in every story that we do to understand that this may take some time, but all the secretaries of states that I've talked to in the last few weeks have said, they're prioritizing accuracy over speed, and we're communicating that to our audience. So hopefully we can all just, push pause and be patient and wait for the right result instead of jumping the gun.
And John, how's Politico going to handle this?
We are going to, we're not aggressive independently on saying, oh, we think we can call this or that state. We defer typically to the Associated Press. Sometimes there'll be networks to get out a little ahead of the AP, and we would need, if they're out there but AP's not, we sometimes might go with them, but we'd be pretty cautious about it. I'm actually not as worried as I might have been a month or two ago. I think with the media generally has done a good job of educating people that this is an unusual election because of the size of the mail vote, and it may just take a while. People will get it. As long as we don't have botched calls where we say that Florida's going one way and it's really not. I don't think we will.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Jared Miller.
Hi, thanks for sharing your perspectives tonight. I'm a PhD student at Fletcher, and I actually have two questions that come back to some themes that you talked about on money and campaigns, and specifically around advertising. You talked about how this is going to be a record-setting election down the ballot of campaign advertisements, but my question is actually talking about dark money that's much harder to trace, but we know has a major influence, especially on platforms like Google and Facebook that have very little transparency on who's actually advertising them. But this connects to the second question around firms like Cambridge Analytica that were involved in 2016 in both promoting information, disinformation, targeting voters in sometimes very manipulative ways. As from your perspectives, are there firms like that that we need to be worrying about? And how are you going about reporting on dark money in this election?
Juana, you want to take first crack at that?
I actually am going to have to defer because it's just not something I cover, and it's not something I'd be able to speak super well to. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. John?
I think that Jared's quite right in saying that this represents a special challenge journalistically because we don't have the transparency on who's giving the way we do with traditional contributions, and the effect can be large. There are particular reporters who I think are good at this, just not touting Politico, or at least not exclusively. Ken Vogel at the New York Times is really good at this. Jane Mayer at the New Yorker has done groundbreaking work on this. I think it's probably an unsatisfactory answer because I don't think that we've solved this problem of dark money, outside forces, including working not just through traditional advertising, but through manipulation of content that people are reading online. I think it can be quite nefarious, and I don't think we've solved it yet journalistically or as citizens.
So Alison, I know it's not part of your usual beat, but do you have thoughts on this you want to share?
Well, it's I will agree with Juana on, and that's nothing I've dug into myself. And I'm grateful that there are a team of reporters that really do get into this because it's so important. But I do wonder, there was so much of this that went on 4 years ago. We know it's going on, and I feel like is it the kind of do we find out after the election what really went down that's going on right now? Behind the scenes, and I wish I had more answers for you, but it's very much worth looking into, and it's a very important story.
Okay. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks.
Our last question of the night goes to Isabel.
Hi, thank you so much for agreeing to speak tonight. I'm a undergrad student, and I'm a sophomore, and John, I'm actually in the political psychology class with your daughter.
Oh.
And I didn't realize that. But so that's cool. I guess my question is about basically like the role of what you guys see as the role of local newspapers in the future. Particularly because I was reading like a New York Times article that just came out about how there's been a lot of local newspapers that like the local newspapers are in decline, and some of them have been subverted by Republican operatives who have basically like taken control of the news, and like there's been some things where, like, for example, there was like articles written about Sarah Gideon, who's Susan Collins' Democratic rival, and some other Democratic opponents for Senate seats. So yeah, I was just like thinking about, and also I feel like it's just people tend to focus now, I feel like, more on national news sites. So I just was wondering like what you guys see as like how we
Okay,
can
so
safeguard local news.
do local newspapers have a role in covering the political landscape, and is their role declining, I guess is really Isabel's question. So Alison, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, well, it's a huge, huge problem that's been made only worse through this COVID pandemic, in that more and more small, print outlets and newspapers are just going under. And I worry about it a lot. It's where so much amazing journalism comes from. And it's the people who hold local officials accountable. And, there is just, it's really sort of a disaster. So I'm hoping, I don't know much about this angle about Republican operatives, sort of moving in and taking over on some of these outlets. But I just can only hope that when we're on the other side of you know, this pandemic and whatnot, that some of these places come back. And I agree with you. There has been sort of more of an emphasis on national news to some degree. And I'm one who, you know, I worked at a local TV station in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I did the daily, you know, the weekly city council meetings, and they're so important. So it's an excellent point you bring up. And I think it's something we should all be watching.
I also read that story, Isabel, and I thought it was really fascinating. And it essentially makes the case that there are these sites that are popping up across all 50 states that are filling the vacuum where local news coverage has dried up. And instead of providing news, they're often providing propaganda coming from think tanks and political operatives, according to the Times story, which I do urge everyone to read. It's really smart. This is something that really troubles me too, specifically the drying up of local news organizations, and particularly local political coverage. I think there's no better training ground as a journalist to learn how to cover national politics than to learn how to cover a local community, to do the city council meetings that Allison's talking about. It teaches you how to be a great investigator. It teaches you how to find good stories and to source build. So as a journalist, it really troubles me. And I know that when I travel to different communities across the country for my stories, the first thing I do is turn on the local news channel or pick up the local paper. And so I think we have a real big problem in our hands in the industry. And I'm hopeful that we can find a way to keep these local newspapers, these TV stations, their local public radio stations afloat, because I think our communities need them and it would be a great disservice to lose them.
John, you have a last thought on this question?
I do. I'll try to be brief, but it's such a good question. Great journalism depends on three things working in tandem. You need a great editorial model. You have to have a vision of what you're trying to achieve as a newsroom and organize yourself around that. That editorial model's got to work in concert with a business model. Unless you're just going to be kind of sustained by some wealthy benefactor and subsidized, and I don't think that's a very promising model for most communities. You need a business model that works with the editorial model, and you need a great owner, somebody who's committed to the right values. The problem with local news is that the business model of has been failing. It's been a long term. 20, 30-year decline. Really what we need is innovation with new business models. And probably the editorial model will look a little different too. I think hanging on to the old model in which basically local journalism was funded by classified advertisements, they're gone, largely gone to Craigslist and car advertisements, the car dealerships basically were funding a lot of stuff. They've got more efficient ways to reach their audience. The only thing is just to give a note of optimism, rather, so it's not all despairing. I certainly agree with the comments that my fellow panelists have made about the nature of this problem, but the problems tend to get solved by people who want to solve them. And I think 10 years ago, national journalism, people were saying, well, gosh, how can we live without a robust New York Times? And the Times answered that question and said, we actually do think we have a new business model. And so they're much more dependent on subscriptions and less dependent on advertising than they would have been in the past. The New York Times now rather healthy. That achievement's not been replicated by many metropolitan newspapers. Some are doing interesting experiments. I think the Boston Globe is doing some interesting things with its subscription services around healthcare and health sciences with Stat. The Minneapolis market, and thank goodness Minneapolis has been such a huge story this year with the George Floyd death and the riots that followed. The Star Tribune there has revitalized itself. It has a more sustainable business model and a whole new innovation. Min Post is supplying some of that. So the organization I helped found, Politico, was an example of innovation in national politics, and it's worked well, both editorially and business. And we've got some people who replicated that. We need similar success stories at the local level. We don't have them yet, but I guess I'm optimistic that they'll be coming.
Well, that's a wonderfully optimistic note for us to end on tonight. So thank you for that, John and
Yeah.
Isabel, thank you for that great question. And I want to thank our three panelists, John Harris, Juana Summers, and Alison King. You really gave us some invaluable advice and some really terrific insights into what's happening with journalism generally, locally, nationally, and how we cover the election. So thank you all so much for joining Tisch College tonight. We greatly appreciate it.
Really fun to be with you.
Thanks so much for having me.